The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the SLA Competitive Intelligence Division webinar. Today, we will be speaking with Zina Applebaum on the topic of My Non-Life, the story of my CI success. Just some housekeeping notes before we get started. Coming soon, Tuesday, October 9th, we'll be speaking with Peter Grimm, CEO of Cipher, on Trend Monitoring 101, how to differentiate between indicators and trends. Be sure to sign up for that webinar. It will be delightful and informative. Also coming up, I'd like to give a thanks, shout out to our sponsor, Aurora WDC. Coming soon will be details on their annual Reconverge G2 Symposium. As a survivor of this symposium, I can tell you it's a great way to network. It's social, it's inspirational, it's informative, and a splendid time is guaranteed for all. With that, I'd like to do a quick round of introductions before we get into the meat of our session. Today, we'll be speaking with Zina Applebaum. She's the author of a blog post we'll be discussing today. Zina is the director for a professional firm and corporate segments, legal, tax, and accounting in Canada for Thomson Reuters. Myself, I'm Phil Britton, Strategic Business Insights Leader for Dino Group, LLC. We've got our bios here. Zina, do you want to give a quick plug on who you are and why we're talking to you today?
Sure. So I'm Zina Applebaum. There's my lovely photo. And I'm sort of one of the first people who really brought competitive intelligence to the legal world. An avenue that I fell into, as many of us have in competitive intelligence, and have just been writing about and articulating how I feel about competitive intelligence as it relates to the legal profession. And the blog post that we're going to talk about actually falls out of that. So I won't spoil anything ahead of the time, so no spoiler alerts here. But I've been doing CI in the legal field for about 17 years now. And in 2015 was inducted into the CI Council of CI Fellows. So that was exciting for me, and it really kind of demonstrated that I think I know what I'm talking about. So happy to share that with all of you soon.
Awesome, thanks. And then for everyone else, my name is Phil Britton. I work for Dino Group, LLC, a competitive intelligence consulting firm, does primary intelligence gathering primarily. My background, similar to Zina, I fell into competitive intelligence. My background is retail. Worked in retail for approximately 25 years. Been doing competitive intelligence for roughly 18 of those years. And I'm asked to speak at competitive intelligence events and share my knowledge, and that's what we're going to do here today. A little knowledge sharing. And then with that, Zina, you mentioned the blog post that kind of kicked off this session. A couple months ago, you published a blog on your non-life. Would you like to give us a bit of a synopsis here and talk a little bit about it for anybody who hasn't had a chance to read this yet?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would encourage anyone who hasn't read it. The URL is there. I'm not sure if you can actually click on it through your webinar screen right now, but I would encourage you to read it. So the genesis of this is that, as I said, I've been in the legal profession for likely about the last 17-ish years or so. And it's been a very interesting journey for me. I fell into competitive intelligence, and I similarly fell into the legal field. And to be honest, after my first 2 years in the legal field, I was going to leave law and go elsewhere. I was looking in technology, which is funny that that's where I've ended up now. And I ended up staying in legal. And one of the reasons I ended up staying in legal was because I had amassed this tremendous intellectual capital in the legal sphere. And so it just made sense that I stay there. And what's funny is that like you, I talk at a lot of events. I share my knowledge of competitive intelligence, of the legal profession, and primarily of soft skills, which we're going to get to a lot today too, which I think has been, in a lot of ways, my saving grace. I mean, I think anybody can learn competitive intelligence, and there's always this great debate around whether or not CI is a profession or a series of competencies, and anyone who knows me knows where I sit on that divide. But either way, what would happen is I would go to these events, and you sit beside somebody on a plane, and they ask who you are and what you do, and you start to explain it, and then they say to me, "Oh, so you're a lawyer?" Or what kind of law do you practice? And I have to say, oh, I'm not a lawyer. And then they kind of look at me like, oh, okay, but you're a librarian. And I have to say, no, I'm not a librarian. And then they get very confused and they don't understand how I could possibly be contributing to competitive intelligence in law firms, working very closely with librarians and being neither of those things. And so this particular piece was written actually on a plane on my way home from doing a 2-day workshop with the American Association of Law Libraries, or shortly thereafter, on competitive intelligence for people in the legal sector. And I just sort of was like, I'm sick of having, not sick of it, because I actually kind of find it amusing at this point, but I find it funny that I'm constantly describing myself as a non, as if to suggest that I am not anything, when in reality, I actually think not being the thing, while in some respects it's made life a little more challenging, it's also given me a lot of opportunity. And I think that's what we're going to delve into today, is how being a non-lawyer, being a non-librarian, and currently at Thomson Reuters being a non-technologist actually gives me a different perspective and the ability to comment on things in a very different way.
So I have to say, reading the blog post, I got a chuckle out of it. I printed it out as a preparation for this discussion, and I showed it to my wife. My wife works in the legal department of her company, but also is not a lawyer. And she just started laughing because she's had the exact same experience you have, and in some cases is reminded by her peers that she is not a lawyer. She will get emails and meeting invites addressed to all the lawyers and Veronica. So some people really are big on making that distinction about what you're not. So I think you've really kind of touched a nerve here.
Yeah, I have to say the response to this blog post has been overwhelming. I think I did hit a nerve. I think I hit a nerve with people in all kinds of different professions and in all kinds of different industries who are just trying to make a difference in their organizations. And I think that that's amazing. I think that if there's a way to connect with people and the ability to articulate what you're feeling and how you're feeling can really help make those connections, you'll be a better CI practitioner for it. So I love that I've hit a nerve with people, and I love that my message is resonating with people beyond those who it was intended for.
Oh, absolutely. And since we're going to be talking about a blog post today, and that's not really a visual medium, for those who haven't read it, I took the liberty of creating a word cloud of the blog post so you can see what pops out here. And the word non is front and center. So you mentioned this in your intro on CI being a series of competencies, part of your skill set. How do you feel that being a non in this area, non-lawyer, non-technologist, has helped you develop into who you are today?
It's a great question. I think one of the things that being a non allows you to do, and I tell the story about my not going to library school, and I'll recount that for anybody who hasn't read the blog post in a minute, but I think by not being, by being something other than what most people in an organization are, it allows you a different perspective. It allows you to think a different way. You're not sort of bound by codified or established ways of thinking or a doctrine of learning. What's interesting about competitive intelligence, I say it's a series of competencies. I think it's a series of competencies. And if you think about the traditional process of competitive intelligence that gets shown at every, anytime there's a CI 101 or any kind of introductory course on competitive intelligence, there's always that sort of information gathering, doing your recon, then doing your secondary research, primary research, doing your analysis, and you can all complete that cycle, those of you that are familiar with it. We go through that, but everybody's going to take a very different tactic to it. And there's a lot of different people doing CI in the world. Some of them are MBAs, some of them are librarians, some come from a financial background, some come from a deep strategy background. And I think by being a non, so being none of those things, it allows you to see the world in a very different way. My husband and I have this debate all the time about whether or not we'll encourage our children to go into the liberal arts. Because going into the liberal arts at some point makes you de facto a non unless you specialize later in grad school. And I think that provides a really great footing for anything else that you want to do, because it allows you to think a little bit about arts and culture, a little bit about language and semantics, a little bit about analysis, a little bit about a lot of things. And it's not quite a jack of all trades. I'd actually say it's laying a really broad foundation and going deep when you need to. So there are moments and there are tasks at hand where I need to go deep on certain things. And when I go deep on them, I rely on my CI training and my CI methodologies, but I don't have to rely on looking at the law in a certain way or looking at a library taxonomy in a certain way, because I haven't been trained in those disciplines. I look at it in the way that I think makes sense given the project at hand and the context.
It's funny you mentioned that, because I kind of view myself similarly as a Swiss Army knife, if you will. I've got a lot of different blades, each does a particular function, but it's probably not going to be my go-to tool if I need to cook in the kitchen or work on my car. But, you know, it's a broad enough skill set in my pocket that I can handle a lot of different situations.
Yeah, and it's a great analogy. I mean, it means basically it's something you want to carry around with you, something you always want to have on you, but you need to know which blade to pull out when. So, you know, it's really that idea of having a broad rather than deep skill set, but going deep when you need to, or calling in the experts more importantly. So you might use the corkscrew on your Swiss Army knife, or you may choose to actually go and get a corkscrew that's more robust to open, you know, a better bottle of bubbly. So I really like that analogy. I think it works well in this context.
Right. So this kind of leads into sort of your history. You say in the blog that despite being all these not things, you hope to have a really long career in your chosen profession. So I take it you find your non-specialization to be an advantage?
I do. I really do. I mean, I think, like I said, it gives me that perspective. And I mentioned the not going to library school story. So let me backtrack a little bit. When I was working at the second of my two law firms that I was with, we had a change in management, and the director of library services said to me, I want competitive intelligence reporting into the library. I want to move you into the library. And I kind of looked at her like she had two heads, and I was like, I don't know anything about libraries. I'm happy to have librarians help me do research. I had some great library techs who helped me do research, but I'm not a librarian. I'm a marketer. Like, I understand how to market, how to talk to the world, how to do business development, arguably how to do sales, but not librarianship. And she said, don't worry about that. What I actually want you to do is to teach the librarians how to do all of those things. So move into the library. So I moved into the library, and one of my first meetings was with 3 senior law librarians at the firm. And we sat around a really long table in the library, and we had a conversation about what I did and how I used research and how I mixed primary with secondary, and then I did this layer of analysis. And they looked at me like I had two heads, and I think they got but they got a little bit anxious about what I was going to do with the information they were going to provide and how it was going to get used. And so then I started to get anxious, and feeding off of their energy, I thought, I better apply to grad school, and I better become a librarian so that I can message better to these people if I'm going to be working with them. So I go through the arduous process. I apply to library school. I asked the director of library services who had brought me in to be a reference for me. And she said, of course, happy to be a reference for you. So time goes by. I think, you apply in whatever January and you get in for the following September kind of thing. So I apply, I get in, and in the interim, I had a baby, or I was maybe off on maternity leave, and my son was 9 months old at the time, my older son, and I get my acceptance to library school, and I think, great, okay, I'm going to go to library school. I'm going to bridge this gap between me and the librarians. It's all going to be great. And then reality set in, and I was like, oh, I have a 9-month-old. I have a full-time job. I can't add part-time grad school to the mix right now. And by the way, this would have been a second master's degree at this point. And I was like, I can't do this. And I started to freak out. And I said, you know what? I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to go to library school, and I'm just going to let things happen as they do. So I go back to the library director and I said, listen, I got in. Thank you very much for your letter of reference. Obviously, it helped me get in, but I've decided not to go. And a huge smile comes across her face, and she says to me, oh, thank God, I never wanted you to go. I was happy to support you, but I didn't want you to think like the rest of us. And I thought, wow, that's so interesting. And it stuck with me. It's, one of those moments that sticks with you. And she said to me, I didn't want you to think like the rest of us. And I think not being able to think like, and it's not even that I want to think like everybody else. And so I learned it. I'm not capable of it. I'm not wired the way a lawyer is wired. I'm not wired the way librarians are wired. And so being able to think differently, to go back to your question about why I think it gives me an edge, I think it gives me an edge because we talk a lot about diversity, and I think it brings a diversity of thought to the table. Being able to think differently, being able to share different experiences, having different experiences. I think being able to pull different lenses and perspectives, different sources, and different layers of judgment to things really gives me an edge. And I do think some of it is soft skills, and I do think that that's an area of the academy that is maybe lacking. You don't see a lot of courses being offered in professional degrees. So when you talk about library school, you talk about law school, medical school, engineering, even teachers college for that matter, you don't see a lot of courses around how technology is impacting the profession and what technologies you need to learn. You don't see too many things around communication skills and how those are important, presentation skills, which are different than communication skills. And I think diving into some of those areas and providing that broader Swiss Army skill set really does lend itself to providing a different perspective and really being able to help an organization mitigate bias. And we talk a lot in competitive intelligence in the Academy of Competitive Intelligence, or not the Academy of Competitive Intelligence, but in academic writings about competitive intelligence, we talk a lot about being able to remove bias and being able to analyze information free of cognitive or other biases. And I think being able to think differently, even from the get-go, gives you that opportunity. And so I think that's one of the things that will allow me to have a really long career in this field.
So you and I have had many conversations on pretty much this exact topic. Do you feel that, again, having that broad base and that broad skill set, being able to think differently has given you the opportunity to speak up and to be more of that outside voice? And how has that worked for you?
Again, it's a great question. And I would say, I get asked this a lot when I teach competitive intelligence and when I teach people how to go through and combine their primary, secondary, do their layer of analysis using, 2 or 3 different frameworks, depending on the topic at hand. We always, and particularly in law firms, we always struggle around this idea of whether or not to give recommendations. Do I give recommendations? My lawyers don't want recommendations. And I see this question you're asking about whether or not it gives me the ability to tell it like it is, very similarly. So the advice I always give is, and the way I see it is, you want to be able to give those recommendations. That's what you're being asked to do. That's what you're really being paid to do. I mean, anybody can. Information is ubiquitous. Information is out there. The real competitive advantage that a CI practitioner, that somebody who's done deep analysis on a particular business problem can bring to bear is their recommendations. It's how the 2 fundamental things in competitive intelligence are avoiding surprises and planning for the future. Well, you can't do either of those 2 things if you haven't provided some sort of recommendation. That being said, it can be very challenging. It can be very hard to be sure yourself of what you're recommending, but not only to be sure yourself, but to have the confidence to say that to others. And the higher up you go in the food chain, or the higher up you go in the organizational structure, it can be somewhat easier because if you've grown with the same company, you start to build that trust. And I remember actually it was Dr. Craig Fleischer, who once taught me that it takes 7 years in an organization to build trust. And sometimes we aren't at places for 7 years. I've only been at Thomson Reuters for about 15 months. So how do you engender that trust? How do you build that confidence? Very, very difficult to do. And it's that confidence and that trust that you need in an organization in order to tell it like it is. Sometimes you'll get burned. Sometimes people don't want to listen to what you have to say, and in the background you have to be the I told you so person, although I recommend you never actually say that. So it's a great question. Do I think it provides me with the opportunity to tell it like it is? I think it allows me to be objective. And the ability to be objective can go a really long way. It means I don't have to think about the limitations of a profession. I don't have to think about the limitations of, if I was a librarian, based on this job description, I would only do these things. If I was a lawyer or a technologist and this was my job description and these were the expectations of me, I would only have to do these, or I could only do these things. So I think being a little bit removed from it, I'm able to be more objective. And if I'm more objective, I can come at it with a level of confidence and a level of objective research that gives me that edge. It's not easy. And it's something that I've had to build up over years. And I do occasionally have a great thought, or I've done some analysis that leads me to a certain conclusion that I'm a little dubious about, and that's when I will rely on my network and rely on either my bosses or the people that I report to sort of say, hey, what do you think of this? The research is pointing me in this direction. The analysis is saying this. I think what I'm presenting is accurate, but I'm a little bit scared of the reaction. And it's hard. It's hard to be the one who has to stand up in a room and say, well, no, it's got to be this way or that way. And those are, again, I think being a jack of all trades, master of none does give you some objective perspective, but I do think it can also be really challenging.
So taking what you just said about applying it across the organization, it also strikes me that this goes back to your answer on the previous question, talking about the sort of the academic version of competitive intelligence with the rigor and the models and all this other stuff. And in the real world, competitive intelligence doesn't occur in a vacuum. It's not academic. It's messy. You're dealing with areas of specialization. You're dealing with customers. And what you've talked about is really being able to bridge that gap between the textbook approach and the real world approach.
Totally.
Is that where you're coming from?
Totally. So there's two angles to it. And Elise Knockold, who some of you may be familiar with, who's actually also with the Sedula Group, she's the expert on strategic versus tactical CI. And when you think about CI in a vacuum, CI theory, almost none of us do CI the way it's laid out in a book. And the reason for that is largely because our organizational cultures get in the way. And whether it's a culture of law firms that are very risk averse, whether it's a culture of a public company or a small startup, they're all very different cultures. They have very different expectations. And to be fair, competitive intelligence, not being a regulated profession, you're going to have a whole bunch of different approaches to things. Some will be more strategic, which will more likely align to theory, and some of it is very tactical and will more likely align to business development, to sales, to product development, to some other area within the organization. And so the question for me is, it's two things. Is CI strategic or tactical, or the version of CI that you are practicing within your organizational culture, is that strategic or tactical? And once you kind of understand that and understand what the expectations of you are, that's one side of it. The other side, where theory and practice don't always align, is around the idea that, how do I describe this? That it is reliant somewhat on judgment and intuition. And again, intuition is one of those words that you don't really want to use in relation to competitive intelligence, because it should be based on empirical data, and it should be based on robust analysis. But sometimes when you're pulling together the various opinions within an organization, it's just as important for you to lean on the various roles within, or the various departments within your organization, to get to those answers. So the long and the short of it, Phil, is there's two camps. There's strategic versus tactical, and then there's the idea of being the center of the hub and spoke model, where your spokes are marketing, business development, sales, R&D, research and knowledge management, and then you're at the center of that, trying to coordinate and collaborate with all those people, and not thinking like any of them kind of helps you be the translator maybe between the technologists and the marketing people, or the R&D people and the research and the more qualitative researchers. So it's kind of balancing those two things that I think is really where CI theory and practice collude, but also maybe don't play as well together as one would think. But the reality is that's everything. You go to get your MBA and you learn all these wonderful things in modeling, spreadsheets, and finance and HR, and nothing really works the way it's supposed to in textbooks.
Which I'm just chuckling because that's totally what I've seen, and this lends itself to the where should CI reside question. Should it be in strategy or marketing or HR or wherever? And that's a whole different can of worms we're not going to open right now.
But if I may for a second, Phil, that question of where CI resides, and the fact that in every organization it could reside somewhere different, and by the way, it can reside somewhere different within the same organization every couple of years, that really underpins the idea that you need to know a whole bunch of different things, because one day you could be reporting into marketing and have to talk to marketing people, and one day you could be reporting into knowledge management and have to be able to speak knowledge management. I've seen CI reporting into finance. I've seen CI reporting into tech when it's competitive technical intelligence. So you need to sort of have a sense of your organization's culture, but you also need to have a sense of each of those disciplines and what they mean, what's important to them, what they drive at, and what their individual departmental objectives are versus your overall organizational strategy to help be successful in CI.
All right, so I have to say I have absolutely never had that happen every year for 5 years running with my department rolling up into a different functional vertical. That's absolutely not happened to me. So
I think you're lying.
Over and over. Yeah, I might be stretching it a bit. This actually leads us to a question we got from one of the audience members asking about that HR question, which is, if you have a very job description, you're a bit of everything, you don't easily fit into one bucket, how have you successfully built that career in multiple firms, different companies in different areas, by being, despite being somebody who doesn't easily fit into one sort of job description?
You have to learn to market yourself. You have to learn to brand yourself. You have to learn and do a little bit of competitive intelligence recon on yourself and on your own skill set to understand what value you bring. So if you're going to say, I'm not any of these things, but you should hire me for this job, that's great. I'm hooked. But tell me why now. And so this is where, and one of the things I do talk about a fair bit is around personal branding and around understanding your genuine self, what makes you you, and how that is unique to you, but that unique feature is something that the organization should be tapping into and could be tapping into. And so take yourself apart, treat yourself like a CI project, do research on yourself, talk to the people around you, do some primary intelligence on yourself, or outsource it to somebody else if it's too difficult, so that you can actually be objective, and get some people to answer the question, what makes this person unique? Some of the other ways to do it are to look at things in your life that influence you, write a bunch of those things down. What are your favorite books? What are your favorite bands? What social media sites do you gravitate to, or what online information sources do you gravitate to? And then look for the common themes that will help you define your authentic self. And then also look at your skill set. Look at what you're good at versus what skills you're known for. And take all of those things together and come up with what your value proposition is outside of and notwithstanding the fact that you may be a non. And that's a really important exercise to go through, and recognizing that people are evolving animals. It's an exercise you want to go through at various stages in your career, because what's important to you at one stage may change in 4 or 5 years, or even in 4 or 5 months, depending on life circumstance. So go through that exercise every once in a while, be able to define your value proposition to an organization, and why that matters, and why your non-skill set is unique, and what you can bring to the table that might be different than somebody who thinks a particular way.
That, you know what, that's a perfect lead into the next question I wanted to ask. And you mentioned favorite books. My favorite book on business is The Godfather by Mario Puzo. People might not think it's a business book, but trust me, it is. And in the movie, the character of Tom Hagen, played by Robert Duvall, he's the Don's consigliere. He's the advisor, but he's not Sicilian. He can never be in the family. He can never be a made man. But that outsider point of view gives him that sort of trusted advisor status, because he can step back and think about business dispassionately, because he's not in it. How have you worked on, especially let's look at, say, Thomson Reuters, which is still relatively new for you, being a little over a year, if I'm correct?
Yeah.
How have you earned your way into that trusted advisor yet outsider status?
So there's a couple of different things, and everybody will find what works for them. And I think that's important. Again, it goes back to that idea about confidence. But when you are a non, it's very easy to lose your way and allow your own insecurities, of which I have many, allow your insecurities to overcome you. And it's very important to not go to that place. Recognize whatever level of an organization you are hired into, that you've been hired for a reason. Somebody saw something in you. You saw something in yourself that made you apply for that particular role, and hold on to that. Hold on to that, but I would recommend in your first or early days of building trust, do a lot of listening. When I first got here, I sat through a lot of meetings and I would just listen and watch and start to try to pick up the language so I could understand what people were saying. And I remember somewhat early on, somebody had said to me, "Oh, you don't talk much in meetings," or, you don't say much. And I thought, that's really funny, because anybody who knows me knows I don't stop talking very often. But I wasn't comfortable in my own skin until I knew that I had something to say of value. And being that I'm a CI person, it's not just that I have something to say that's of value, but I've also validated it against various sources. And I wait until I can do all of that to be comfortable speaking. And then once the floodgates opened, they opened. But I would say spend some time listening, spend some time understanding the organization in various contexts. So when you think about, I work for Thomson Reuters, which is a publisher. It's also a technology company. It's also a legal, tax, and accounting research organization. And so I spent some time learning about each of those different elements of the business. And every business out there, much like every person out there, has many faces and many dimensions to it. And you don't want to learn about only one or two of them. You want to learn about all of them. And you don't need to learn about any of them, again, in a very deep way, but you need to learn about all of them and enough to understand how the composite pieces came to be, and to sort of understand the historical context so you can position yourself to be a part of the growth of the organization. And not just, it takes time. It's funny, you mentioned your favorite movie book. One of the ones that I use, and I've shared it a fair bit with some people in SLA, is the book Stuck by Oliver Jeffers. And it's actually a children's story about a boy who gets a kite stuck in a tree. And I won't ruin the ending, so no spoiler alerts on this one either. But to me, that's a really great business book in terms of stepping back and gaining some perspective. So I encourage you all to check it out. It's called Stuck by Oliver Jeffers. Okay,
so as part of the SLA Book Club, we have reading assignments for all of you out there. The Godfather and Stuck, available at your local library. Okay, or Amazon. Let me transition a bit into another non that appears on your LinkedIn profile. You are not a professor, yet you teach a course at the University of Toronto. So here you are, a non-professor teaching a class. How do you leverage that non-status with your students?
That's a really interesting one, and it's one that is, I never get mistaken for actually being a lawyer, although I do sometimes. But when I'm called professor, and often I'm referred to, people will email me and say, Professor, about assignment, and I'm like, nope, just call me Zena. It's one where I will push back and not want to be called a professor because I feel like without a PhD, I shouldn't be called one, and it's reserved for people who actually have gone the extra mile and received a degree or been conferred with a degree. How do I deal with that one? I think it gives me a perspective, and it gives me some ability to step away from academic understandings of things. So again, when I'm in class, one of the things I will do is I will very clearly say, academic understandings of competitive intelligence say this. The chapters I had you read in your textbooks last night said this, or say this, or position this. In the real world, this is what has happened in my experience. And that's one of the ways I sort of differentiate it. It goes back, it's a nice full circle, in that it goes back to your earlier comment around the theory and the practice being very different. And I think that's one of the ways that the professorship plays out. It's interesting, actually, that I neglected that piece when I actually wrote the piece, that I do teach, and I'm not actually a professor. I'd like to be one day.
That would require going back to school yet again?
Yes, yes.
So, so I just have to say, with my career in retail, I find myself being in that non-status as well, because I've worked retail for 25 years, and I was never a salesperson, ever. And salespeople tend to run retail as they do in a lot of organizations. So it was interesting that I was always viewed as a, quote, support function, even though in a retail store or at the corporate office, if you didn't ship the product, you couldn't sell anything. If you didn't process the billing, you had no money. So it was interesting from that perspective in my life as well, in a totally different industry than what you've been in. So just a comment there. One of the things you say in the blog post came from a keynote at SLA this year, I believe. You said one of the most important things in both your career, professional organizations, and for anybody is really to become more relevant. If we were giving some advice to all the nons out there listening into this, what's your advice for becoming more relevant?
So my advice for becoming more relevant is to constantly be aware of what's happening in the world. We tend to be very myopic. We tend to stay in our little bubbles, and we go to work, and whatever industry we're in, so retail in your world or legal in mine, we tend to focus on that and read the news pertaining to the retail industry, read the news pertaining to the legal industry or the technology industry. Know what's happening with 87 pharmaceutical companies in the world because you work for one of them, but forgetting to look at sports scores or know who the most relevant writers of the day are, or what people are watching on Netflix. Again, you don't need to watch all those things on Netflix, but you need to be a person of the world. You need to know what's happening in the world, because those are the things that are influencing the way people around you think. And so there's a whole bunch of stuff happening on Netflix. There's a whole bunch of stuff happening in the news that I may not tune into on a regular basis, but I know it exists. I know Game of Thrones is a thing. I know that people watch it. I know that it has these kinds of characters and those kinds of characters. Obviously, you follow the news in other countries. It's kind of hard to avoid following the news in the United States. But you need to know, again, it goes back to that Swiss Army thing. You need to know a little bit about a lot to stay relevant. And it doesn't require a lot of concerted effort. There's a lot of great consolidated or annotated little news clipping services. So LinkedIn does like a great top 5 things you need to know today. Every morning I read that. There's a couple that go through Twitter as well. I know that there's the skim reside.com for anybody who's listening, which is geared more to women, but it sort of tells you what's going on in the news at a very high level. It's very US centric, but again, I think one of the easiest ways to stay relevant, and we're blessed in this world of information, we're blessed with the ability to stay relevant by staying on top of the news. That being said, you want to avoid information overload or infobesity, and you want to be judicious about how many sources you read every day, which sources those are. So you don't want to feast on a diet of Fox News all day. But once in a while, it's actually really enlightening, and it's actually really helpful to see what's going on in the world and understand what the different perspectives are. So in addition to staying on top of the news, I would also encourage you to listen to an artist, a music artist that you would normally not listen to. Go to an art gallery if all you ever do is go to sporting events, or vice versa. So you get to see a little bit of what's happening in the world beyond just what's in your direct line of focus.
So in order to present that diversity of thought back to your internal clients and lay out the information, you yourself need to have that diversity of intake.
Yeah, and I think it also
stay relevant.
Yeah, I mean, you stay relevant that way in that you know what's going on in the world, but you also, you grow as a person, and you're able to make connections with different people in the workplace, with different people in life, wherever that may go, wherever that may take you. And by making those connections, that's also how you build trust. And building trust goes back to earning trust within an organization, or getting people who don't necessarily understand or value your skill set. Trust is the way to overcome that.
Right, and trust is also there when you have to tell somebody something that's going to be incredibly unpopular.
Yeah, and we very
in your
often
role
don't
as a CI person.
Yeah, absolutely. And as I said earlier, we often don't have the 7 years that it takes to build trust. So staying relevant and being able to make connections with people personally and professionally about very substantive topics of interest, but also about, you know, Game of Thrones or what have you, really helps build those relationships and encourage some of that soft skills that I had mentioned also.
Yeah, well, that makes that makes total sense. All right, that's actually kind of brings us full circle. Is there anything else you would like to relay to our listeners today? Anything else you'd like to add?
Yeah, I see there's a question here coming in from the audience about what librarian skills can be honed to excel in CI. It's a great question. I think one of the things that's particularly fascinating to me is librarians' ability. Again, I don't know when this gets taught in library school or iSchool or whatever version of information professional discipline, but two things that actually are really important to me that I think are useful are the idea around taxonomy and classification of information and search skills. So I think those are two things. Librarians can find things that I don't know how to find. And once they find them, they can categorize information or sources in a way that I think fit really, really nicely into the analysis piece of CI. And you may not have the financial acumen, you may not have the strategic acumen that comes from doing an MBA, but what you do have is a different way of organizing and understanding information, whether it's primary or secondary, and being able to pull that out, I think, are two really fantastic librarian skills that I don't see in other disciplines.
That makes total sense. And there was one other question, and this goes back to the info obesity comment you made earlier, which was actually a completely different webinar in a session I've heard you give in the past. If you want to touch briefly on how you help both yourself and your firm with your knowledge diet, your information diet. As knowledge workers, we all deal with this drinking from the fire hose, and there's no shortage of information, as you said earlier. What are some of your top tips for maintaining a sensible information diet?
It's like anything else. I mean, we watch what we ingest. We should also watch what we ingest in terms of what we read. And so you got to mix the good, high quality stuff. So you got to mix The Economist with, you know, I don't know, teen magazine or with whatever trashy magazine you want to read that day. And don't stick to a heavy diet of one or the other. And, you know, somebody asked here, how do I ingest it all? Am I a speed reader? I'm not a speed reader. I'm also not a news junkie. So I don't spend days and days and days and hours and hours and hours reading the news. I know a lot of people who are like that, and they're glued to the TV. They're constantly have CNN on in the background. I don't. I devote a certain amount of time every day to that, and then I move on, because like anything else in life, you need a little bit of balance. And if you're constantly reading news about your industry or news about the world, you're not getting to the other things in life that you need to be doing. And so pick your sources and stick to those sources, but make sure that within that source list, you have a variety of formats, but you also have a variety of levels of sophistication and a variety of topics, so that, you know, there's maybe a handful of things I read on a regular basis, much of which is Canadian and local and would be less interesting to most of you. But then I have a handful of sources that I only read occasionally, and a handful of sources that are not really sources. They're just kind of fun things that I do, or fun things that I read to help keep me human, right? Like, we're people, we need to be people, we need to be able to engage with other people. And so it's finding that balance between all of those different types and formats and kinds of sources. We'll keep you we'll keep your analytical fitness where you want it to be, I think, but we'll also keep you from, you know, information overload.
So speaking of that, this will kind of get to this next question that we got. We'll kind of get to the balancing the here and now versus the future. And I'm going to ask you to put your futurist hat on here. How do you do this in regards to the changing landscape? The question we received was specifically about the, quote, fourth industrial revolution, things such as 3D printing, diversification of manufacturing, et cetera. But how do you balance the here and now with the what's next, and how do you try to stay use your non-perspective to stay ahead of some of those what could be really technical trends?
Well, what's really amazing is, being a non, I don't understand the technical side to any of those things with any depth. And I'm the first to acknowledge that. So I understand what 3D printing is. I sort of broadly understand the capabilities of 3D printing. I understand that people are doing some really interesting and innovative things, you know, making huge advancements in access to pharmaceuticals and access to artificial limbs, things that otherwise people wouldn't have access to through 3D printing. I don't understand how it works on a very technical level, and I don't need to. It's kind of like, and you're the wrong person to be saying this to, but it's kind of like, I get into my car every morning and I know that I do certain things to get me where I need to go, but I don't know what's going on under the hood, and I don't need to. There are lights, there are sensors, there are things that are going to tell me when the car is not working. And then there are people like my better corkscrew that I can rely on to fix my vehicle for me. Some of them are reliable, some of them are not. That's a judgment call that I have to make the same way I do with information, but I don't need to understand the intricacies of it. And so in terms of the future of CI, I think it has a very long and bright future, because it can be so many different things and mean so many different things in different contexts. The methodology will always be the same. The level of rigor that is required to get to meaningful answers, I don't think will be diminished. I think the amount of information that is produced on a regular, reoccurring basis, I mean, there's probably been, I don't know, how many hundreds of thousands of tweets since we've been on the phone this last 45 minutes. There's so much information, but there's so much opportunity to take that information apart, to apply artificial intelligence for semantic analysis, to apply natural language processing to a subset of data that exists in the world and analyze it in a way that can help you make business decisions. I think CI is only going to increase in its visibility, increase in its usefulness for organizations. It may have a different name. It may morph into various things over time, but I do think the future is very bright. And I do think the future is very strong for people who can analyze information and help organizations, corporations or otherwise, make strong decisions and good decisions to avoid surprises and plan for the future based on that information.
So in a world full of doubt and uncertainty, people like us are more important than ever, is what I'm hearing.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that the world is entirely filled with doubt, but yeah, I mean, I think it's a great time to be an information professional, to be totally honest with you.
I would agree with that. All right, final question. Is there anything I didn't ask you about being a non that I should have asked you?
No, the only thing I would say is, you know, when you think about your life as nons, and I know many people who are members of the SLA-CID who might be on this call right now are non-librarians or non-CI professionals who want to become CI professionals. I would say become people of the world, make sure that you're not just focused on one or two things professionally, and grab onto mentorship wherever you can get it. Mentorship is hugely, hugely important. It not only helps direct your career, but it also helps provide balance and make sure that when you know, like anything else, when you grab a hold of those mentors, make sure that you encourage diversity of thought in terms of the people that you align yourself with and the people that you read and the content that you read.
Okay, I think that makes total sense. All right, with that, I think that concludes the main body of the webinar. Zena, thank you very much for taking the time to talk through this blog post. And for anybody who hasn't had a chance to read it, I encourage you all to do it and to embrace it. I think it will strike a nerve with many of the people out there, like it did with myself and even folks outside of the knowledge management world. Just one final housekeeping note. We are going to do another plug for the October 9th webinar with Peter Grimm, CEO of Cipher. Please join us for the next SLA CID webinar, all about trend monitoring and how to differentiate between indicators and trends. With that, thank you again, Zena, and that is all we have for today.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for tuning in.